let's look at the general anatomy of the heart here. So the heart is basically this pump. We said it's sitting in the center of the thoracic cavity. It's in between the lungs. It's sitting on top of the diaphragm. So the inferior border of the heart is formed by the diaphragm. The left and right borders of the heart, excuse me, are formed by the lungs. We've got the superior border of the heart, basically having all of the vessels that are exiting and entering the heart, so the pulmonaries. We've got the aorta on top, the vena cava. And then if we look at the size of the heart, it's usually correlated to the size of your fist. So if you're a large individual, if you're male versus female, your heart is usually the size of your folded fist, unless you have some type of cardiomegaly or some type of enlarged heart. Your heart is usually correlated to your fist size. Usually weighs about 250 to 350 grams total. And the heart is actually wrapped in this sac called the pericardium, which has several layers to it. We've got the outer fibrous pericardium. And the purpose of the pericardium is to lubricate the movement of the heart. So as the heart is pumping, specifically the ventricles are pumping, and the atria are, relaxing to receive blood and moving that blood down into the ventricles, there is this movement of the heart, and the sac, the pericardial sac or the pericardium, has a thin amount of fluid in between the layers there, and that fluid helps to lubricate the movement of those layers of the pericardial sac and reduce some of the friction that would otherwise be seen as those layers move. Okay. And so here we can see the heart resting on the diaphragm here. Now the anterior border of the heart is going to be the sternum. We talked about the sternum in anatomy so far. So the body of the sternum specifically sits right anterior to the right ventricle here. And then the posterior border of the heart is going to be the vertebral column, specifically the vertebrae T1 to T4, where we have, the posterior border of the thoracic cavity in general. Now I want to point out here where the ventricles are located, because the heart is slightly askew left. It's slightly shifted left. So what we can see here, the right ventricle is the anterior surface of the heart. The left ventricle is going to be the left border of the heart, mainly the apex. We call this part of the heart the apex. The atria are going to be on top. So this is what we call the base. This top part of the heart is called the base. And this is the region that we see the atria. So here's the right atrium and here's the left atrium. And these are the locations of the various chambers of the heart anatomically. So the heart is not the four chambers, straight on the way that we typically draw it for simplicity's sake, but it's actually slightly shifted left and slightly askewed left in the thoracic cavity. If we look at the outer layers of the heart, it's got three layers: the epicardium, which is the outer external membrane, the myocardium, which is the muscular middle or the meaty part of the heart, and then the inner layer, which is the endothelium. This is really an epithelial layer of the heart. And we can compare the heart to a giant blood vessel. So when we look at the blood vessels later on, we're going to see that they have this exact same order of the layers. It's got an outer layer, it's got a middle muscular layer, and then it's got an endothelial layer, which is really that epithelial lining of just cells stacked against each other. In this image, we can appreciate a cut surface of the heart here. We can appreciate the larger left ventricle. So if you can see, the left ventricle wall is much thicker than the right ventricle wall. And I kind of explained this a bit earlier, but the reason for this is because the left ventricle has to work against the resistance that we see in our arteries, especially the high resistance that we see in the arterioles. And so it naturally just hypertrophies a little bit because of that harder, because it has to work harder against that resistance. And so it has a thicker wall as opposed to the right ventricle, which only has to face the pulmonary circulation. And so it's not a lot of branching. And so the pressure here is not as high. And so the wall of the ventricle here is not as thick. All right, so what we're going to talk about now is the valves and the unidirectional flow of blood through the heart. So I mentioned earlier that we've got these four valves present. We've got two that are separating atria from ventricles, and then we've got two that are separating ventricles from the arteries that are exiting that ventricle. And so the pressure difference throughout these chambers is what actually creates this unidirectional flow. There's always movement from high pressure to low pressure. So the normal flow of blood is from the atria down into the ventricles and from the ventricles out into the arteries. This happens on both sides of the heart. So from right ventricle into the pulmonary artery, from left ventricle into the aorta. And so having valves helps to prevent any backflow of blood back into the previous chamber. And it keeps blood moving in that unidirectional fashion. But what we want to understand here is that the valves are not, the valves are not actively opening. They're not actively moving. They're passively moving. And so the valves are not made of muscle, right? They're usually cartilage and connective tissue. And so they only open when the chamber that's preceding the valve has a higher pressure than the chamber or vessel that's after the valve. And so a really good example is if you take the right side of the heart, blood will only move from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery when the pressure in the right ventricle is higher than the pressure in the pulmonary artery. Likewise, blood will only move from the right atrium down into the right ventricle when the pressure in the right atrium is higher than the pressure in the right ventricle. And so the movement of blood through these valves and through the heart is a passive process, and it requires these pressure gradients so those valves will open up passively. The valves are not actively opening, actively contracting. They're not made of muscle. They're actually just cartilage and connective tissue. Okay, let's look at the atrioventricular or AV valves first. So the AV valves are valves that separate an atria from a ventricle. We've got them on both sides of the heart. So using this little GIF that I've got here, hope you can see that. The first AV valve, which is called the tricuspid valve, is on the right side of the heart. It's separating the right atrium from the right ventricle. And this one has 3 cusps, and I'll explain why it has an additional cusp in a bit. And then the other AV valve is the left AV valve. It's on the left side of the heart, sometimes called the bicuspid or the mitral valve because it's shaped like the mitres hat. If you play chess, it's shaped like the bishop in the chess pieces. And so it's usually preventing backflow from this left atria down into the left ventricle. And so the purpose of the AV valves is to coordinate flow, again, preventing any backflow from the ventricles back up into the atria and keep the blood moving down from atria into ventricle. Now, if we look at the AV valves, they're usually connected to the papillary muscles and the chorda tendineae. And these are 2 important structures. The papillary muscles are these upward projections of the ventricle, and we can appreciate them in this image below here. So the wall of the ventricle has these upward kind of finger-like projections of muscles. And those are connected to these non-muscular, again, connective tissue structures, which are the chorda tendineae. And then the chorda tendineae are connected to the valves themselves. And so what happens is when the chamber contracts, right, the blood would try to squeeze back through this valve, and to prevent that from happening, when the chamber contracts, these papillary muscles contract and they pull down on the chorda tendineae, pull down on the leaflets of the valve, and actually shut and anchor that valve tightly closed, okay? And so there's a coordination between the contraction of the wall of the ventricle and the tight seal of that valve. So when the papillary muscles contract, it pulls on the chorda tendineae, it pulls on the leaflets, and it helps to secure the seal between the atria and the ventricle, and it prevents the pressure that's rising in that ventricle from pushing the blood back up into the atria. And so it's really important that this is happening as the chamber is contracting. If we look at the semilunar valves, they're differently located and they have a different function. The semilunar valves are the aortic valve. So the aortic valve helps to seal the communication between the left ventricle and the aorta. So here's the aorta in red, and then here's the left ventricle, and then here's the aortic valve. And then the pulmonary valve is helping to seal the communication between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. So again, here's that right ventricle, here's that pulmonary artery, and here's the pulmonic or pulmonary valve. And these are not attached to the muscles. These are not attached to they don't have their quarter tendonae or the papillary muscle attachments the way that we see with the AV valves, because these valves are really trying to keep the blood flowing out to the vessel and preventing any backflow from the vessel, from the arteries back into that chamber, into the ventricle. Now, I said I was going to explain the reason that the tricuspid valve here has an additional leaflet. So the bicuspid valve has two cusps or two leaflets, they're sometimes called, whereas the tricuspid valve on the right side of the heart has an additional cusp or an additional leaflet. And the reason is because the right side of the heart is getting all of that blood coming back from the systemic circulation coming back through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And so it has a high volume coming in as blood is returning to the heart. And so it's really important that as the right ventricle squeezes and tries to contract and move that blood out into the pulmonary artery, since we have more volume here, it's really important that this leaflet is extra, has an extra tight seal to prevent that larger amount of volume from going back up into the right atrium. And so essentially, because we have more volume on the right side of the heart and more pressure on the left side of the heart, we need an additional leaflet to really secure and prevent any backflow of that additional volume coming into the right side. Okay. All right. And so that's all that we'll look at as far as this packet, which is the functional anatomy of the heart. So basically the structures, kind of how they work, how the circulation happens. And so it's really important for you to have an understanding of the overall circulation, right? What series, what's parallel, you know, the fact that this is a closed system generally. And then also have an understanding how the dynamics of what's happening on the left side of the heart differ from the dynamics of what's happening on the right side of the heart. You know, the different valves that are located, the different exit points. So we've got the aorta on the left side, we've got the pulmonary arteries on the right side, we've got the pulmonary veins coming in on the left side, we've got the vena cava, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava coming in on the right side. Okay. And so I'm going to pause here before we look at these questions and see what additional, you know, confusions or questions you may have at this point. All right, so let's launch a poll here and let's put some of that to the test here. Okay, last couple of seconds. All right. So in which way does most blood in the systemic circuit flow to organs and why? And so many of you selected C, which is correct. It's flowing in parallel. So remember, we're talking about the systemic circuit here. So only the blood that leaves the left ventricle travels out through the aorta to the arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, and then back into the right side of the heart. And so all of that blood flows in parallel. And what that means is that each organ system gets its own cut of the blood, its own share of the blood, and it can regulate independently from the other systems. So the blood that's going to the brain has nothing to do with the blood that's going to the lung. It's not the lungs. the blood that's going to the liver, the blood that's going, to the reproductive organs, the limbs, etc. And so the correct answer here is C. In the systemic circuit, the blood is flowing in parallel. Each organ system receives fully oxygenated blood that can be independently regulated. Okay. And so the reason that D is incorrect is because this dependent on the next is not true, right? It's independent of the other branches of that organ systems. Okay. Let's look at another question. All right, last few seconds here. Okay, let's see. So which valves help keep blood flowing in one direction from receiving chambers of the heart to pumping chambers of the heart? And many of you selected B, which is atrioventricular valves, and that is correct, okay? So remember we said AV valves separate atria from ventricles. Semilunar valves separate the ventricles from the arteries, okay? And so the aortic, which is option D, and the pulmonary, which is option A, are both semilunar valves. The AV valves are going to be the tricuspid on the right side of the heart and the bicuspid or mitral on the left side of the heart.